this pulse of energy is released, by a big gun, essentially, when it is fired, that damages the way the brain works.
Tiny bits of damage build over time, triggering things like depression, anxiety, headaches.
The pressure I go through, some days I can't leave the house. It's just horrible, really, like feeling like this constantly and not knowing why.
Could we be talking hundreds or thousands of people?
Certainly thousands. They're stuck in limbo.
I think, frankly, a lot of medical professionals in this country, at least, don't really know what they're dealing with. Right, Martin, what's the easiest way of understanding what traumatic brain injury is?
So traumatic brain injury is a wider term. It's to do with anything from an outside blow that causes damage to your brain. It might be being hit around the head by a baseball bat. It might be a car crash, all these sorts of things. What we're talking about in this example is slightly different. It's blast-induced traumatic brain injury. And what that is exposures to smaller shocks from things like blasts over time. And what medical professionals are saying increasingly is what they're noticing is that these shock waves, you imagine if you kind of clap your hands next to a candle, you could extinguish the flame from that shock wave. Well, those shock waves have an impact on our body and on our brain as well, but it can be at the microscopic level. It was described as the microarchitecture of the brain, the neurons, the brain cells, and these tiny bits of damage build over time, and the impact appears to be on people's brains, triggering things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, headaches, and even issues with balance. And it does, as I say, it seems to get worse over time.
That's the scientific end of it, Paul. You've been leading this investigation. Tell us how it all started.
A friend of mine who served in Afghanistan, and he's sort of been onto me saying we need to do something on this in the UK. We're not hearing about this in the UK. And he sent me lots of material, lots of sort of scientific research, mostly from the States, but also from Canada, from Sweden. And so I spent a day reading through this, and it was a kind of jaw-dropping moment when it was really clear the direction in which the science was going. It was equally clear that this must affect British servicemen and women and veterans, and that there was a story here that wasn't being told, and a problem here that wasn't being addressed.
Well, we went to see somebody who we think suffers from this condition, Ian Huxley, who's a veteran, former cavalryman. We went to see him back in the autumn, didn't we, Paul? Let's have a listen to how he described the effects of traumatic brain injury on him and his family life.
They're getting a person who they know is their dad and who loves them, but they're not getting the fun, outgoing me who, and don't get me wrong, I'd do absolutely anything for them, but they still miss out on so much because the way I feel and the pressure I go through, some days I can't leave the house. Sorry.
No.
Yeah, it's just horrible, really, like feeling like this constantly and not knowing why.
God, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? I mean, I watching that, for those who are listening, you can see in his eyes that he's quite a broken man by his experiences. Yep. I just wondered, Geraint, you were talking to him. It seems to me quite a lot of the impacts are quite similar to PTSD. That must make it really difficult to diagnose this and get clarity.
Yeah, well, I think it's difficult for sufferers like Ian to get clarity in the first instance, because most of the time, and he's been to see 29 doctors, is it, Paul? Been put on a variety of medications and various therapies by medical professionals, but he's been treated for mental health problems like PTSD, like hyperanxiety, hypervigilance, stress, trauma, as a result of being on the battlefield, because that's what doctors have grown used to doing in the last 10, 15, 20 years since people have been coming home from the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan. What we're talking about here is something quite different. You identified at the start, Martin. Physical damage to brain function when this pulse of energy is released, by a big gun, essentially, when it is fired. That damages the way the brain works. And I think the symptoms are, all the victims we've spoken to, Paul, the first thing they say is headaches, isn't it? This absolutely unbearable headaches, cluster headaches, sensitivity to light, blurred vision, problems with balance, and then the kind of problems that we would associate with inhibited brain function. So problems with memory, problems with concentration. But there is a big problem with diagnosis because I think, frankly, a lot of medical professionals in this country, at least, don't really know what they're dealing with.
Yeah, and at the moment there's a problem, isn't there, with not just the diagnosis but the treatment, in that really there isn't a treatment. You can try and mitigate some of those symptoms. You can, maybe exercise might help. I know for Ian that was a case. Going out running helped him sort of clear his head slightly. You can do rehabilitation to help with balance. That's something they're doing at Stanford to help military personnel there, and then counselling to, I guess, help those military personnel try and deal with the problems that they're having as a result, potentially, of these physical things. But it's really difficult, isn't it, Paul, from all the people you've spoken to, the countless conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really horrific condition to have. And just to sort of come back on the point about diagnosis, what complicates things further is that the two conditions, traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions, can coexist.
Yeah.
You can have both at the same time, which is kind of like a horrific double whammy. It's very difficult to work with this kind of condition. It's very difficult to have a family life, as we've seen with Ian. It has and I think the effects have these ripples on your children, your wife, the people around you. There's effects in terms of there's a higher rate or an association between traumatic brain injury and higher rates of suicide, association with higher rates of divorce. So there really is a life-changing condition to have, and one that it seems increasingly clear that many thousands of veterans may be suffering from.
We've had experience of being near bombs when they go off and explosions in various places around the world that we've reported from. I won't forget, I remember last time I was in Gaza, missile landing relatively close. That sense of the shockwave and your teeth bang together, and it's extremely unnerving experience. Now, soldiers, veterans like Ian will have experienced that on the battlefield, but what's more kind of insidious here is the blast that they've experienced during training, because their exposure to that when they're firing a big 30mm cannon off the top of a armored vehicle. They may fire hundreds, if not thousands, of rounds, and when their head is right next to the firing mechanism, they're getting that blast wave. It's happening all the time, and it's that repetition that's doing the damage, right?
That's exactly right. And there are different types of weapons that we know are likely to be causing more damage, and in particular sort of indirect fire systems, some types of artillery, mortars, some shoulder held anti-tank weapons, 50 caliber sniper rifles, even, and those big 50 caliber machine guns that you see mounted on vehicles. So yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. If you're serving in Afghanistan, obviously you might expect IEDs and so on, but exactly as you say, just in the normal routine training, potentially a number of soldiers are being exposed to this dangerous overpressure.
Well, I mean, on this, nobody's saying if you're on the battlefield, don't fire a rocket launcher if you're under attack. Of course you could and should, but it's that training thing, isn't it? And there are some parallels to sport. You think of rugby, you think of football, where they're stopping doing heading in training sessions. It's a similar thing to that, and that's kind of where, with my science hat on, that now the MOD are thinking.
You've permanently got your science hat on.
Thank you very much.
It never comes off.
It never does. But this is where the MOD are thinking, well, can we use some of this science to help us get more clarity on that diagnosis, on what maybe is and isn't safe? So, two places we've been to film at recently. One is the University of Birmingham, and they're looking at biomarkers. So if you get a brain injury, not only does it change the function and the structure of the brain, but it also can change the biology of the brain, and these different chemicals are released. So if you can find those markers in whether it be a blood sample or a saliva sample, you can see that there has been some damage. So within a couple of years, potentially, you could have a saliva test where you could say, Geraint, you've just been close to that shockwave. Here, take a little saliva swab. Actually, you've sustained some damage. Let's try and remove you from that situation to give you time to recuperate. And so that potentially has a huge scope. The other one, which is slightly more fancy looking, is a new posh brain scanner, basically. So the gold standard still for seeing brain damage is an autopsy. You slice up the brain and you can see the damage. Obviously, that doesn't work for people who are still alive. The next best thing at the moment has always been an MRI, those big magnetic donuts. You put someone in, you can see to a very fine level any damage within the brain, but you can't see to a small enough scale. You can't really zoom in quite enough to see this real micro damage. And so what this new technology is called OPM MEG, and it looks like a bike helmet with about a couple of dozen sensors in it. And what they're looking at is the impact the electrical signals in your brain have on the magnetic fields. That's all very complicated. The way it was explained to me is you're looking at the function of the brain rather than the structure. So imagine you get home and you turn the lights on in your house and a couple of them aren't working. Now, you don't know which is broken. You don't know if it's the light bulb, the fuse, or the flex, but you know that something isn't quite right there. And so what this technology can do is essentially say something isn't quite right with this person's brain. We can't exactly pinpoint exactly where it is, but something has changed. And so if they can get that working, again, potentially they could put one of these big scanners on the back of a truck, take it to a firing range, say, right, Paul, you've got an anti-tank gun. We're going to scan your brain beforehand, scan it afterwards, do that with 50 different personnel, and we can then work out if this is something that is safe to be used in training or not.
And we're still very much in the foothills in terms of treating.
Very much, yeah.
But across the pond in the United States, Paul, in terms of recognising it in the way that Martin's describing it and taking preventative measures, they're somewhere ahead of us.
There's a few things they're doing in the United States that I think will probably find their way to NATO more broadly, or certainly to the UK. So one thing is there's just some common sense measures you can take to reduce your exposure, fire fewer rounds from those more dangerous weapon systems, range officers place themselves further away, and so on. So there's those sort of basic things that frankly they could do that tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And then there's a sort of range of other things that they're looking at to make sure that training isn't sort of negatively affected. But over time, procurement surely needs to take this into account. That's being talked about in Congress. Actually, there's some proposed legislation there that would require blast overpressure to be considered right at the stage of kind of designing and building weapons. So there is, in terms of sort of preventing future damage to future generations, there is quite a lot of things that you could do without really fundamentally sort of ripping up the rule book and starting again.
We've got some significant development in our investigation that you are responsible for. Martin, you went to see the Army about this, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'll give Paul the kudos because he's been chasing the MOD for a long time. And to be fair to them, they gave us access to the science that they're doing, and they are ramping it up a lot. And I spoke to Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, who's the MOD's lead on brain injuries. He's focused on it. It's his baby, and he is driven to try and make a positive change. But in that conversation with him, he was able to tell me that actually, really for the first time, we think on camera, that an acknowledgement from the MOD that this damage potentially is being caused by your own weapons, not just a blast caused by somebody else, and also the scale of the number of people this could affect.
Over especially the last 5 to 10 years, we're starting to appreciate the role of what we call low-level blast. This is predominantly exposure of our service personnel to blast overpressure from their own weapon systems.
How many people could be impacted?
That's a difficult one.
Could we be talking hundreds or thousands of people?
Certainly thousands. And of course, if we look then back at our veteran population, so although our current service population is up to 200,000, we have a veteran population of a couple of million.
Wow. That feels like quite a big omission, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's good that they're recognising it, and as Martin said, making a lot of effort, putting a lot of effort, a lot of money into research to try and find diagnostic tools. But the real problem here is that often these symptoms present later, much later than the blasts that caused them. So people are in the first instance going to their GP because they've left the army, they're veterans now, and they're going to their GP and presenting with this sort of constellation of problems that GPs will recognise only as a psychiatric disorder. So, for instance, the Royal College of GPs has a leaflet about veteran care, which it sends to all its members, and so that they are looking out for things when they're dealing with veterans, looking for things like hearing loss, ankles, knees, backs, and mental health conditions, traumatic stress disorder. That leaflet doesn't mention TBI, nothing there at all. So unless you're a kind of particularly diligent GP who's across all the new medical science coming out, which is, I've no idea how many papers a year, but there's lots of it, or has a specific interest in neurology, there's no way you're going to necessarily see these kind of complex constellation of symptoms and say, well, actually this person needs to go to neurology. And if you do go to a neurologist, you're not guaranteed to have this diagnosed or recognised, because the brain scanning that Martin talked about, the brain scanning that we took Ian for, is not approved for clinical use by NICE. So it's not approved for NHS use. So I can't, as a GP, say, right, what you need is a brain scan, I'm going to send you to get one. That at the moment isn't possible, which is kind of staggering, really, given that we've seen what it can do. And it's important to say, I think, that people with traumatic brain injury can have a decent life. You know, there is hope. It's not the end of the world. But the problem is that at the moment, the veterans that we've spoken to are just stuck in this limbo where they can't even get a diagnosis. They can't even find out what's wrong with them. So anything beyond that is just inaccessible, and they're stuck in limbo.
And they're living with symptoms that they don't understand, and that can lead to, as we've already highlighted, family problems, breakups, substance abuse, and then all the problems that come with that. So it's a kind of it's an emergency situation because of the in itself, and also because of the problems that it causes down the line.
It really is, and it's costing. It's an association with domestic violence. There's an association with the criminal justice system all round. There's a high risk of suicide. You know, these are all things that are preventable. These are not places where for having, you know, served your country, this is not really where you should be going. There should be more help available. Almost all these people we've seen, their wives have become their carers. The sort of circle, the ripples of suffering is far wider than just those individuals, and there's no support at all, really, for the families who are going through this, and that's a real tragedy too.
Yeah, and time is a big thing, isn't it? Because these cutting-edge science things I was talking about, best case scenario, you're a few years down the track. Realistically, by the time they're approved, you're looking a lot further down the line. And this has been, because it's so difficult to point at one thing and say it's a direct result of that, it's very easy not to take action. But if you look back, I've seen her comparisons to sort of smoking. It wasn't until more recently that we knew exactly what smoking was doing and why it was causing cancers. But we could see from statistics those people who were smoking had an association. And if we are seeing that association here, which it appears that we are, then there is a duty to act on that, even when maybe the science hasn't completely formulated itself. Because we know that the wheels of government take a long time to act, you almost need to take a leap in advance, don't you, to say, well, these people need support, and we can't wait that long to give it to them.
One of the reasons this subject is so close to your heart, Paul, is because you're an ex-soldier yourself. So I'm left to say, Lieutenant Tyson, where does our investigation go next? We want to hear from more people who think they've got this problem, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of interested to hear from people who think they may have this problem or have experience of this. But, you know, I'd like to look into all of those aspects. What's the association of this with? We reported, right, on suicide amongst veterans on our program.
For a long time, yeah.
Many times, and for a long time. And if you look at those suicide statistics, the association with blast, exposure to blast, judging by occupation, jumps out of the page at you. Now, it's true that those same occupations that have a higher exposure to blast are also more likely to place you in conditions where you may have mental trauma problems. That's true. So it's difficult to unpick that, but there is nonetheless a striking association with blast exposure and suicide, it seems, from the very limited data we have on veteran suicide in this country. But what we really want to do is to speak to ministers and to ask, you know, whether they really recognise the scale of this problem, whether they really recognise the impact that this is having, not just on those individuals, but on their wider family, and what they're going to do about it.
We've received our orders, Martin.
Yes, sir.
Thank you both, Paul as well. Thank you both very much. And for more of our reporting on traumatic brain injury, go to itv.com/news. For now, thank you for joining us.